So I would like to welcome Razan Idris. I cannot tell you what a pleasure, what an incredible honor it is for me to welcome Razan back to Duke as one of our most treasured daughters. At Duke, Razan was a Reginaldo Howard Memorial Scholar, a scholarship named for Reggie Howard, Duke's first African-American student body president who was tragically killed in a car accident. This scholarship is awarded to a student who has shown great commitment to, quote, academic achievement, leadership, community service, and social justice. This describes Razan to a T. In her senior year, Razan was awarded a Mellon Mays Fellowship for her research project on marriage and race and Islamic law, a project that became her honors thesis for which she was awarded highest honors. This project also formed the basis of her graduate work, for which she received a full fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. There, at Penn, Razan works with the renowned scholar and MacArthur Fellow, Eve Trout Powell. At Duke, Razan did Duke Engage in Dublin, worked with refugees through the Injaz program, and worked for the DC-based organization Karama in their law and leadership program. She was also actively involved in the leadership of the MSA. While Razan was at Duke, she was not just a student, but a partner in learning and a seeker of knowledge. Her thoughtful engagement with Islamic texts made her a sheikha worthy of her lineage as the daughter of sheikhs. I would also just like to say a word about Razan's character. Sometimes I would be walking across campus and I would catch a glimpse of this woman with a great aura floating across campus. And she would bring great peace to me, a great peace to my heart. And I would think, who is that woman? And then I would realize that I knew that woman, and it was Razan. So welcome back.
Thank you, Ellen, so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to keep laughing because it was just so sweet. But yeah, again, thank you so much to Ellen, who was my undergraduate advisor and a big reason why I was able to navigate having those early studies at Duke. And thank you so much to Julie Maxwell as well for having invited me with Ellen and the Duke Islamic Studies Center for this talk. It's really great to be virtually in conversation with everyone here again, seeing as how many times I was sitting in the building listening to a academic talk in my own time. It's really funny to be in that position now myself. And so I'm so excited to share with you all today. I think I'm probably going to speak for around, I'd say 30-ish minutes, just because I don't want you all to be staring at Zoom for far too long. And then there'll be a lot more time for question and answer. And so today what I'm hoping to do is to give y'all a more personalized talk, hopefully more of a conversation as well, about my trajectory studying Afro-Arabs in the Middle East, intertwined with my own reflections on the racial politics of graduate school and of Afro-Arab studies as a field. And so this might get a little bit rambly, but I think it'll be fun. So with that, let us jump on right in. So my first thing that I wanted to talk about was what brings me to Afro-Arab studies. And so I have a few images up here, which I'm going to use as the jumping points for my discussion of what brings me to this field. And that is, firstly, I am Sudanese-American. I was raised in the US for the early years of my life. And I was raised within a pretty cosmopolitan, I'd say, like Muslim community. And then when I was 9 years old, moved to Sudan. So when I was in Sudan, I happened, to be coming of age. I was thinking a lot about questions of identity, and I began to find out interesting things. I began to find out, for example, that quite a few of my older family members had met Malcolm X and other Black Muslim American figures during their own times of study abroad. And this led me to start engaging with texts such as the Autobiography of Malcolm X, and where he famously has these explorations of what does it mean to be raced in the Arab world? What does it mean to be Black in the Arab world? These were very interesting questions for me as I was growing up biracial within Sudan and trying to think about the American experiences and civil rights histories that I had known about, and my own experience of increasingly noticing colorism and other forms of exclusion within Sudan. And so during this time period when I was in Sudan, I was seeking out these types of texts and discussions to have an understanding of what exactly is going on in the region, right? What is going on with my own experiences? How do I interpret them? But this only really kicked off for me when I returned to the US and began to experience just how little easily accessible cultural and social history information there was about Sudan on the internet at the time. So what you see here right in the middle is a little screenshot of a Tumblr page that was called Vintage Sudan. I frequented this very often as someone who was trying to find any kind of visual, cultural, social information that I could share with others, that I could be like, look, this is what my experience was, this explains my experience, this gives you the context, the visuals, the sounds of what it was like for me when I was growing up in Sudan. And so this is actually run by, Vintage Sudan was actually run by a Twitter user who is Sudanese, whose Twitter @ is written underneath there in the Bilaya, and her name is Haneen. And so she was someone who I realize now was in conversation with me in the public sphere, as were a lot of other Afro-Arab figures, with creating archives online and being able to reach past the ways in which public media, academic media were failing, just like average people, and being able to reach them and to portray to them these experiences that were being sort of left to the side in between different identities, right? And so that was the sort of the second phase of what was bringing me to increased interest in Afro-Arab studies, was my own explorations of it when I came back to the US in terms of my own identity. And then when I came later on to college, it started to become more of a question of understanding my own position of privilege within Sudanese communities and trying to understand that privilege when it was often being couched in because when I studied those privileges in academia, it was often couched in language of race, that it was interesting to me, but sometimes it felt like things were slipping through the cracks. And I was interested in asking myself, what is going on when you have a country where most of the people would be considered Black, but one group are being described as Arabs and others are just being described as Africans, and the implications are often argued to be those of race, of like there are African groups within Sudan, there are Arab groups within Sudan, and they are light-skinned and dark-skinned, and that's what the conflict is all about. These didn't quite make sense to me because of my experience in Sudan, where I was like, oh, but Northerners are dark-skinned too, so what exactly is happening within my own country? What exactly was going on that as a child or as a teenager in Sudan, I wasn't fully cognizant of as someone who comes from a privileged group within Sudan? And so I'm bringing up this story and this like personal trajectory because I think it's important to couch the personal stories and personal politics that bring us towards these studies. I think it's important for us to be able to think about what are these perspectives that are drawing us in. And I think that personal experiences are often ones that are sort of maligned within academia as being something that gives you a bias or something that you shouldn't couch yourself in. But for me, I think everybody is coming into academia or academic studies with their own perspectives, and it's important for us all to acknowledge what those perspectives are, how we're being brought into them. And so that's sort of the personal trajectory of what was bringing me into my interest in questions of race in the Middle East, race in the region, what it means to have a hyphenated Afro-Arab identity. But I think what's maybe even more important is to start to talk about what happened when I was in college and starting to really think about these questions, right? I think this is what I have here is I want to talk a bit more about what it means to talk about Afro-Arabs or be Afro-Arab in the very racialized academy. So the image that you see at the top left is actually from my very first year at Duke University, which is, I believe, when the killer of Mike Brown went unindicted, and the image is specifically from later in that same year when a noose was strung up on Duke's campus and students had to go out and protest. And so my entrance into US university systems was a very, very heavily racialized experience. And not just a racialized experience, but one where I began to increasingly witness a lot of racial violence that is maybe coded as, oh, it's a microaggression, oh, it didn't directly happen to you, etc. But it was a shaping experience of my time at Duke to constantly be witnessing various forms of anti-Blackness play out on campus and then be denied by administration, and then a cycle of Black students on campus having to organize and protest, be met by administrations who would create task forces. And so undergrad was many, many things that were making me think about what is my position as a racialized figure within the US, and how do I understand that historically? How do I understand where these issues of race are coming from? What's motivating them, and then how do I navigate them within a university that is, that was originally built on racial exclusion, and the patterns of which are still affecting me in that university today. So that's the first thing that I wanted to point out. Like, that was the beginning of my college experience. It's very much what shaped my time in college. And I think that what I want to, underneath what you see is an image of a Sudanese protester, al-Azhar, who was prominently photographed in the Sudanese Revolution of 2018 to 2019. And this was a photo that went very viral around the world. And what I want to point to with that is the fact of how being Sudanese was also a major experience for me within the academy, thinking about who was being represented during my studies and during my time there, and who was being brought up as a point of understanding or a point of conflict. So, for example, when I first entered the political science department at Duke, because I did do one major in political science, it was very rare to find anything that discussed Sudan. And one of the reasons why is because political science is a very racialized profession. It's the one where race has shaped what is thought of as international relations, who acts on the stage of international relations, etc. And so for me, as someone who was following revolutionary rhetoric in Sudan and protests that were happening during my time when I was in college, smaller scale than the ones that happened in 2019, but still important news, and trying more and more to stay connected with what was happening abroad, it was very apparent to me that this was not information that I would be getting much about in the academy. What instead I would be exposed to I would be walking through campus and find an advertisement telling me that I should sign up for a winter forum where you can pretend to be Sudan and South Sudan entering another civil war, right? And so it was constantly, like, people of my background were treated as case studies and theory. So this is a fun theory that you can play out, that you can try to understand, but never actually represented, never actually brought to the table. And so all of this is to say, I was experiencing like two understandings of how racial exclusion was happening when I was in the academy, in undergrad. I was thinking about the American anti-Blackness, American violence against Black people. And I was also thinking about that on an international level. And I was also starting to think about anti-Blackness within Sudan itself, and who gets to be represented as Sudanese and who gets to be excluded within there. And so there was a lot going on all at one go. And I bring up this personal story or personal narrative just to be like, when we talk about what it means to be Afro-Arab in the academy, I think it's really important for us to be able to recognize the raced ways in which knowledge functions in the academy. Who is excluded? How is that knowledge formed? And who is considered and who is brought to the table to form knowledge? No matter what your field, it is a very raced process. And so to be able to talk about what does it mean to have Afro-Arab studies, et cetera, is inevitably to talk about how does race function to produce? Who talks about Black people and how are they talked about? And how are Black people ever allowed to be the people talking? So that's part of what I want to talk about with this personal trajectory of being Afro-Arab in the racialized academy and what that means to me. The next part that I wanted to speak about a little bit more was what it means to see Afro-Arabs when you begin to do work on Black people in the Middle East, specifically in Arab-speaking communities, I think one thing that we realize, anybody who's in Middle Eastern studies will recognize that it's often a very, what I call a very horizontalist field. And by horizontal, I mean you are encouraged to study Arab nations in relation to one another and never in relation to their southern Black neighbors who they are somehow assumed to be completely disconnected from, right? And this plays out in how area studies happens. And for example, you'll have studies of Egypt that don't have any contextualization of Egypt's relationships with Sudan. You'll have studies of Libya, which prefer to use Syria as a case study in comparison as opposed to Chad, its own neighbor, right? And I think that this means that when you pick up academic books or anything like that to search for more about Afro-Arab identity, you'll often find people in denial saying, there's not many Afro-Arabs, that's not a relevant conversation here, you won't find much. Or on the other hand, you'll be told, oh yes, they're there, but they're always in the background and you're not going to be able to find much information about them. And so I want to challenge that within my own research, within the circles that I'm in. I want us all to be challenged and to ask ourselves, how are we deciding to see? Who are we choosing to see? Who are we choosing to not see? And what types of work are we saying can be done? And how are our imaginations of what can be done often very limited, right? So these two figures that I've put up, these two images. The first one was from the beginning of my slideshow. And you can see it on the far left. And so this is an Orientalist watercolor, just called The Courtyard of al-Azhar Mosque and University Complex, Cairo. It was done by this painter, Ivan, in 1928. And so this image is one that I'm bringing up as part of my research now on Blackness in Egypt. So when you look closely, what you're seeing is a group of men seated who are being taught by this man in the white beard. All 5 or 6 of the men seem to be this vague tan color, right? And then if you zoom in, I guess, a little bit, you can see a man standing behind them who is much darker skinned. And what he is carrying is, I believe, he's a water carrier. And so this is in the background, sort of this portrayal of a Nubian water carrier in al-Azhar Mosque, who is very much relegated to the background, given this sort of grin as he sits outside of the circle of knowledge that these non-dark-skinned men are engaged in. And so there's a lot going on with this image. We can read it as this is how, for example, an outsider, Ivan, was reading the racial scene of al-Azhar, or maybe this is something that he was imagining and placing within it as his conception of what the Middle East looks like. And then on the other hand, we can also be like, okay, well, we can look in this image and see racial dynamics and get an understanding of what the dynamics were in Egypt during this time period in terms of who is being portrayed as part of this religious circle and how. So that's one way that we can push ourselves to think about questions like, how do we see and where are we looking to find Afro-Arabs in the region? But I want to go a bit further. I think that with that image, what we get is like this Orientalist watercolor, right? And we have to sit there and sift through, how is this being portrayed? Who's portraying it? Is this their imagination? Is this like their reflection of the politics as they understand them, etc.? I think we can go further. So what you have on the right is a studio portrait labeled a Nubian Sheikh that was taken by the famous photographer Gabriel Lakagian, who took many of the photos associated with the 1880s Egypt and Cairo. And so if you just look up the source, the information for a Nubian Sheikh, that's all you're gonna get. It's just gonna be like, this is a Nubian Sheikh, we don't know much about him. All we know is that he seems to have been this educated man who is wealthy enough to take a studio portrait at this photographer's home. And so that's already, I think, a bit of that's already us beginning to challenge a little bit of what we're seeing in the left image, which is to question why and how that image is portraying dark-skinned men as outside of the circles of learning within Egypt. Is that because of a general trend? Is it because of how this Orientalist saw Egypt? Like, we are already beginning to see an actual Nubian Sheikh who quite likely would have been in these mosques, right? But then there's a second layer, right, of how we can, of what we're seeing and who we're asking and what we can learn from this image. And here it's going to be a little bit of a story. So this image, if you put it into a reverse search on Google, what you can, or sorry, not on Google, yeah, on Google. What I discovered is that I found it posted within Sudanese Facebook groups, right? Because a Nubian sheikh was one who came from northern Sudan at this point. And what you'll find is that this is not just a Nubian sheikh. This was a very well-known Mahdist figure in northern Sudan who had participated in the revolution of the proclaimed Mahdi of northern Sudan against the British. He came from Dungula, and he was a close associate of the Mahdi until he turned against him and went into exile in Cairo. And so this, what you have when you start to push against like these academic structures that only will look at the archive in a particular way, when you start to actually bring in people as archives, when you start to ask Sudanese, well, who is this person? You'll find it all over these Facebook groups. This is such and such. He was the Mahdist figure, such and such, who has been studied in Sudanese studies. And here are all his great-great-grandchildren happy to talk about where the family is right now and when this and what exactly happened to him and why he was in Cairo in the first place. And so we go from an image of an Egypt where we're told that you can't do much work on Afro-Arabs or you can't find out much about them. We can, by challenging the binaries that are often set up between Middle Eastern and African studies, we can find out quite a lot. We can find out a lot, and not only that, we can interrogate questions of race and racial representation, while also bringing in the stories of actual Black Afro-Arabs who are identifiable and findable and not just hidden figures or silent figures who we'll never be able to identify or learn from. And so that was what I wanted to talk about in terms of discoveries that I've made on my own way, right? Like what I was thinking of when I was looking at these two images was, how do I study anti-Blackness in Egypt, portrayals of anti-Blackness, while also finding these Black figures who I know were there and who I know if I turn towards a different historiography, I can learn a lot from. And that also speaks to another issue, which is where we look to find Afro-Arabs. I think that this is what I want to talk about right at the end. So the question I was asking here was, who speaks for Afro-Arabs? And so this is the images that you're seeing, or the lists that you're seeing, are extracts from bibliographies that I keep for myself. And so to switch from Sudan and Egypt, I have a bibliography that runs about Blackness in Saudi Arabia. One side of the bibliography is focused on newspapers, blogs, forums, social media. And the other side is focused on the right, is focused on formal English written academic publications. And so as you can see, if you turn towards academia and think of the discussion of Afro-Arab identity as one that you have to turn to academia to learn about, and you have to find a formal text or a formal source to tell you more, you're often going to find very little. But if you turn towards general social media, writers, journalists, bloggers, etc., you'll instantly find amazing sets of conversations that have been happening for a very, very long time. And so what I want to say here is that who speaks for Afro-Arabs should always, not always, but should be centering Afro-Arabs themselves. I think that it's very easy for people to walk into Afro-Arab studies and to talk about representing Afro-Arabs or like seeking out the hidden stories of Afro-Arabs. And in that process of portraying it as, oh, there's so little said about Blackness in the Middle East, they'll often center themselves as saviors as opposed to centering Afro-Arabs as people who can speak for themselves. And so I wanted to raise this and say, Afro-Arabs are the ultimate arbiters of should be the ultimate arbiters of Afro-Arab studies. One of the reasons why I bring this up is because I think that the lived experiences of race and politics that push this field are often uncited or unacknowledged in academic historical circles. I think what I want to say is we really need to end the culture of academic articles which begin thus: in 2020, my Black Arab friends widely shared personal experiences and resources and articles on race in the Middle East by all these journalists and bloggers. And I will now, in my article, name none of the above, where I talk about how I discovered this very taboo topic. That academic article beginning I don't want to ever see again. I think that when we have these amazing social media resources in front of us, we have so much opportunity to be centering different communities in how we do Afro-Arab studies. And I think we also have the opportunity to, again, seek out voices who in the past, because of how racialized the academy has been, excluded as biased or unreliable. And so I think that I can end on the note of a Chadian Arabic-speaking Twitter user who said اتمنى أي شخص أسود ما يتكلم عن معاناة السود وخصوصا كنساء سود ويتفلسف نحن عندنا صوت ما محتاجين حد يتكلم عننا. This is a translation. What she says is, I wish that non-Black people would not talk in the place of Black people on Black suffering, and specifically on Black women's suffering, and philosophize about us. We have voices, and we can speak for ourselves. So with that, I think I have the 30 minutes, and thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you so much for a very excellent intervention. I'd like to open it up. Does anybody want to pose any questions or begin the discussion?
Razan, I'd love, first of all, excellent. So good. Curious if you have any experience with looking at the Afro-Arab female perspective. Like, is there a lot of documentation on female, what has been going on with them, or is it primarily from a male perspective? How have you found that in the research?
I think it depends on what region or what time we're thinking about, right? I think the Afro-Arab, for one thing, is such a broad spectrum. It's such a broad area of study. You're talking about everyone from, for example, a half Malayan Tunisian woman writing about discrimination in Tunis today, all the way over to, for example, like Black enslaved people in the Gulf in the 1920s, right? You have all who might have seen themselves as becoming integrated into Arabness, right? So it's a really broad swath of time and of peoples who are all entering from different positions into the region. And so when it comes to women, often what I've done when I've had to do like 19th century texts that are very male dominated, right? I think Ellen indicated that I used to work much more. I still use these Islamic legal texts a lot in my research. But often you have to sort of read between the lines within them to find female figures, and to find more about how they're speaking, what they're thinking, what's happening with them, because it's a time period where men often just have more access to self-representative literary texts, right? But when it comes to the modern day, I would say overwhelmingly Afro-Arab women are the ones who I learn from about contemporary politics of being Black in the Middle East, right? I think that not only, for example, the Chadian activist who I have on my screen right now, but bloggers such as Sarah al-Hassan in Sudan, who talks about colorism in northern Sudan, Fatima Imam in Egypt, who's Nubian and talks about her experiences there, Afifa Latifi over in Tunisia, who's a PhD scholar. I think she might be listening right now, who writes about Blackness in Tunisia. Like the list goes on. And so I think that, I think definitely I learn a lot from Afro-Arab women right now.
Don't be shy, everybody.
Do people want to send questions to the chat and then have them be read out loud?
Yeah, either or.
I can ask a question. Thank you so much, Razan, for your thoughtful reflection on sort of where you sit within academia and sort of your process of getting there. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the decision itself to go into academia, given that it has its problems that you talked about. So sort of why do you think you went down that route, or how do you reconcile the challenges of academia with being in academia? And secondly, if you're interested, not, you know, you can sort of pick whatever you want to talk about, but even a little bit of thoughts on like what discipline you chose, if there was a thought behind like picking a particular discipline that you thought was more suited for the kinds of things you wanted to do. So anything around that would be interesting to hear.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I think I'll address the second part first in terms of like discipline, right? When I was applying to graduate school, what was really important to me was to be in a department where I could combine Middle Eastern studies with African studies. And you'd be surprised how rare that is. So it was Penn, for example, by being in the history department, I'd be able to work with figures like Eve Trott Powell, my advisor, as well as others like Sheikh Babu, who's on my committee, who focuses on, for example, Islam in West Africa. And so I think one thing is that I tended to have to avoid quite a few Middle Eastern studies departments where I didn't see myself as being able to have the flexibility to do that work, whether by reason of lack of courses on offer or lack of interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary work or opportunities, within that department. So for example, here at Penn, I'm in history and I'm with a scholar who focuses more on Middle Eastern studies, but I'm getting my certificate in Africana studies. And so that flexibility was really important to me in terms of choosing my department, and also my advisor and the people who I had around me were really important because, you know, I think that something that people told me before I applied was how important it is to be in a place where if one person bails on you, you're not left high and dry, right? And I think that Penn's history department for me was a place where I could see multiple people for me to work with at different time periods. And that's been great. I think it helps you build up more of a community and have a lot more support than otherwise. But as for the first part of your question about like why academia, you know, great question. I think that, you know, I can give you like the college version, which is like, oh, I thought about it and I realized I was good at humanities and I was thinking about academia versus law versus like nonprofit work, and I tried out internships and I was like, let's do the academic route, etc. But I think that maybe the bigger picture perspective is also a conversation about privilege within academia, right? I think that, I think they say academia is one of the most nepotistic professions. They say like 1 in 4 academics has a family member in academia. That's very true for me. I do have family members who are in academia. And so coming into college, I think I had already begun to be immersed into a sense of what are academic politics? What does the academy claim about itself that is not necessarily true, right? That it is an unbiased, above all things, producer of knowledge that's very special, right? So I'd already been disillusioned a little bit of that from early on. And so, you know, the disillusionment continued. And I think that that was part of what made me a little bit more comfortable with being like, okay, I have a sense of where all these failings are, where all these issues of like how academia is set up are. I have a clear understanding of what the job market is looking like. I have an understanding of like the corporate university. This was undergrad, you know, by force, we had to learn these questions, right? And I think that helped me to be like, okay, I feel like I know how to at least enter and be able to traverse this a little bit safely. So that's one part. I think the other part is also, again, privilege. I had gone to undergrad on this scholarship, and so I did not have undergraduate debt to deal with or to think about for after I graduated. And so, and I also had 2 languages under my belt by the time that I was a senior. And so I didn't have to think about forking out for a paid master's program. And so I had the opportunity to look at, oh, let me do a PhD because I can get a stipend and I will not have debt that I have to pay off immediately. And if it doesn't work out, well, you know, at least I didn't have to go into debt for it. So like money and conversations about money and about access, I think are also very important to why I felt comfortable being able to enter this space, at least for now. So I hope that was helpful and honest enough.
There's a question in the chat that says, so why is it rare to combine African and, from Hiba Ali, why is it rare to combine African and Middle Eastern studies? Why are departments not working collaboratively, or is that just how it is?
I think that's a question for the times, right? I think that on one hand, you have, I guess, these Cold War constructions of area studies, right, that are in US universities, whereby whereby a lot of these departments were emerging from particular strategic foreign interests. And that still applies today. I mean, we still have department and state funding out of interests of US governments in wherever area of the world that affects departments, right? So how departments were constructed, I think, was very influenced by having these ideas of there is a concrete place called the Middle East, and then there's a place called Sub-Saharan Africa, and they're very separate and different, and the peoples of them are racially different and should be thought of differently. And I think that formed a lot of these departments, and a lot of them being formed by people who believed in this stuff haven't really done the work of destabilizing that or reconstructing their departments to move away from those very racialized formations of the region. And yeah, I think that would be my response to that for now.
I have a question. So actually in our class this week, we were reading al-Jahiz, and it's, very interesting from like an 8th century text. We're reading on the superiority of blackness to whiteness. And it was very interesting to see how he's addressing anti-Black racism amongst Arabs, and yet it's very interesting because it's within the Islamic discourse that he's also promoting, a pro-Black discourse. So even though he's criticizing the Arabs for their racism, he's inserting into like the history of Islamic literature his own sort of anti-racism. But apart from that, my question, and I don't want to take up questions. Oh, here. Maurice has a question. He says, lately I've been intrigued by African American groups who adopted Arab identity, such as the Moorish Science Temple, Adin Allahi and Ansarullah community. They often use the Sudanese as inspiration. Are these simply examples of cultural appropriation, or are they a way to find common ground between African American Muslims and Afro-Arabs?
Oh wow, that's a great question. Adina Lillahi is actually up the road from me in Philadelphia, like the original. Well, not up the road, but one of their satellite groups has a mosque that was one of the oldest ones in Philadelphia, and so it's definitely a great question. I think that if I remember correctly, there's been some interesting scholarship on how groups like the Moorish Science Temple used ideas of appealing towards Arabness or Sudanese-ness to claim civilization, etc., and to try and subvert American racial norms. So I think there's more going on than appropriation in that context, because for many of these early figures, it was a way for them to try and subvert, segregation for many of them. But I guess it's interesting. I don't necessarily have a full answer, but it's definitely a question I'm interested in. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in it is in the fall, in November, I'm going to be giving a talk on Sudanese Muslims in the US and African American Muslims in Sudan. And because I think that these are two groups that have actually often very long been in conversation, I think that a lot of the bent of American Islamic studies is to focus on, there is a group of Black American Muslim converts, and then there's immigrants who are assumed to be non-Black. And I'm very interested in what happens when you look for Black Muslim immigrants throughout the century and see how they have related with Black American Muslim converts or Black American Muslim groups, and what are the conflicts or the differences that might have arisen. So I think this is an ongoing conversation. So I'm really glad to hear more people are interested in it.
Other questions? So yeah, I have a question about, as a white scholar who works on Islam and the Middle East, how does one, how does one, so part of the part of the kind of mission, I think, of knowledge seeking, especially about people who are, non-white, for example, this perspective, from the scholarly perspective. I mean, I've always seen it as sort of bridge building, even though I understand that there's like kind of an invasive aspect of it that is, as Maurice said, like a cultural appropriation that's connected with Orientalism, and also like the colonial legacy, the Cold War legacy, the imperial legacy, the racial legacy, all those kind of complicated and ugly dimensions of like, white domination of non-white societies, like not only abroad, but here. And in the university as like knowledge production also. I mean, there's such a problematic, like horrible history of this. And then yet, is that, I mean, a call then, I mean, then what would a white scholar do? Do you then not engage in that kind of like, knowledge seeking or like bridge building between cultures because of like the sort of horrible legacy of, cultural appropriation and like, the imperial Cold War legacy? Like, and you kind of mentioned this about like, it's important to study these issues, of like how much the Afro-Arabs have been occulted in the academy, that it's so difficult to find like, good work on that. And then yet, then you're sort of in an ethical bind there then, because you run the risk of also speaking for, as you said. I know that was very unclear.
No, I think Ellen, I think it's a broad conversation, right? I think that it's a conversation that anyone who is working with a community who that they're not necessarily a part of has to have with themselves, right? Whether it be a white scholar working with, for example, issues of Black Muslims in the United States, or it be, if I had tried to represent some group within Sudan who I am not a part of, you need to have these conversations about, okay, well, what is my place? What is my place to represent, and what is my place to not represent? And I think the first guide is, the first golden rule is, are you making space for the people from the community who you are engaging with? Are you producing with, or are you producing like over these people? I think that there are conversations to be had around, sometimes, yeah, some topics I think are just not appropriate to be written about by an outsider. But I think that there's multiple ways in which we can challenge ourselves as people who are in these positions of like privilege, whether it be through whiteness or other ways, right? I think that, for example, what I would want from white scholars or white Arab scholars in Middle Eastern studies is to start thinking about how race formed their field. I think that that's some very basic first steps that isn't about, that is about thinking about what kind of knowledge they're making and producing. And that's not, that by doing that, that's not speaking over like Afro-Arabs in the academy or outside of the academy, but just beginning with interrogating how race is shaping their own work, whether they realize it or not, and how it's shaping their own fields, whether it be focusing on Middle Eastern linguistics. How are racial linguistics affecting your field? How is race in IR affecting how you talk about the Middle East? How is race in the conceptions of history affecting your studies? I think that is a really important first step that I think this field has not even gotten to yet, of like people having that self-interrogation. As for when you work with, for example, a group of like Black people, etc., I think again, it's all about making space and getting that approval. I think that there's some things where you do not want to be constantly centering yourself as the person talking about it, but it's not a one-all, there's no one-all rule. I think that's probably the best answer. I think the best thing is honesty and humility and being able to be humble with the people who you are working with. And that humility is, I think, what helps us to be able to have interesting forms of study and help us to avoid figures like those we've been hearing about recently, Jessica Krug, and that kind of behavior of feeling like one has to pretend to be something that they're not as a way of trying to erase their privileges. It's unnecessary. One can talk about their privilege, recognize it, do their publication, and center other people as well, and make sure they're bringing them into that space without closing them out, as many of these imposters want to do. So I think that's my also very winding response. And it's a long conversation. It's not one that I think we can fully cover here.
Yeah, and it's frightening too to think it's not just how racial formation has shaped the field, but this racial formation is something that we witness, you know, in the university every minute, and not just in the university, but, you know, walking my kids right now through homeschooling and seeing what they're being taught, you know, or, you know, what I'm supposed to be teaching them. And they ask, well, why are we always studying US history? I mean, as children who are tri-national, you know, I mean, they're constantly asking, why are we always studying US history? I said, well, you know what? That's why I did this. It's because I was brainwashed myself, and I wanted to de-brainwash. You know, I wanted to like learn about other cultures because I had not been taught this in my university education, and as in grade school. I mean, it's like these are knowledge, these are, you know, knowledge systems that are completely not part of the formation of ordinary American kids.
And
right?
I think that what's interesting there is also when people do decide to do this work, how they then portray themselves when they are unlearning this. I think some people enter this unlearning process and they're like, wow, I have confronted my whiteness, look at me, right? Like invite me to the panels, let me talk about it some more, let me talk over actual Black people and talking about how I have unlearned these terrible things, etc. And it brings to mind for me the Sudan Syllabus, which I started curating when I was a junior in college. It was 2017, I believe, when it was launched. 27. No, I was a senior. It was the fall of 2017, and I had just gotten so tired of classes where you could do something like have a political case study of Sudan that had no Sudanese researchers cited, where you could have a little study of it was like that. I was getting tired of being in circles where you could talk about all types of things without actually citing researchers from that region, or citing or talking about greater issues, like, for example, like the Arab world, etc., without talking about places like Sudan. And so that was part of what inspired the Sudan Syllabus, is I wanted to show, if you want to do this work, you can do it. I sat there as an undergrad and collected what is now, I think, a 56-page document of resources. And many of those resources are not formal academic. Some of them are. A lot of them are, but not all of them. A lot of these sources are academic, but there's many that aren't. There's a long list of Sudanese researchers. And I was able to do that as an undergraduate who had access to nothing but Google and my Duke Library's catalog, and seeing what was written up there and asking people for help on Twitter. And so if I, as someone without connections, without like heavy academic experience and publications, was able to do that work to unlearn things even about like my own country, right, Sudan, when I come into academic spaces now as a graduate student in her third year, I just really see no excuse for people to not be doing that work. I really see no excuse for people to be telling me, oh, well, I just don't have the connections, so I didn't invite a Black Arab speaker. Oh, well, I had this like race and I had this race panel, but I'm just gonna invite the same 3 people who I've invited since 1980, right? Like there is no excuse for it at this point. And I think that that's part of why I end on this note of, who speaks for Afro-Arabs, is to push people and say, if I can do it, you can do it too. So.
All right, Yalla Yagama, we want some questions from from everybody. I know everybody has questions up there. Yeah, Afifa Litfi said, people are thinking about race and color at the same time, influenced by each other, but in vastly different contexts and places.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, you know, part of what we're talking about when we start thinking about like questions of Afro-Arabs is we start to have to interrogate questions of, you know, what does it mean to be Black in the region, the eternal question, right? And I think that in many, up to now, I think many of the discussions around this, when they are not done through the voices of Afro-Arabs, tend to be flat. They tend to be like, well, here is the ways in which race fits and doesn't fit, but it doesn't seem very clear to me. Maybe I've read academic articles that say, well, it's just never going to solve it, and it's a very flat way of having discussions that I think can become much more, what's the word for it, detailed. I think that we can go from these very broad swaths of time where someone tries to say, well, this is Blackness in the Middle East since 800 until today, and it's all the same thing. I think that what we can see now and where we can push these conversations as well as be pushed is by starting to ask much more specific questions, right? Like, oh, what does it mean to be Black in 19th century Egypt at al-Azhar, which is like, you know, my research now. What does it mean through the lens of both Islamic legal texts and like the conversations happening in newspapers and the conversations happening in memoirs, et cetera? Like what are the different identities that are at play? When did those different identities emerge? What are the different ways in which these conversations are happening? Where do they intersect with the pre-ingredients, if you will, of race in Europe, and where do they diverge? I just want to see better scholarship. So hopefully that's where we'll go.
Yeah. Questions? Karim Khaled, how do you think the Afro-Arab identity is currently situating itself? Well, Karim, do you want to go ahead and just ask the question yourself to Ustaza Razan?
Yes, for sure. Hi, Razan. So yeah, like I'm thinking mainly about just like our struggle with the Afro-Arab identity in Sudan. And you know how there's a lot of clash. There are Sudanese people who say, well, yeah, we're not Arabs. And then there are some who would say, oh no, we're not African. So like, what parts of like Afro-Arab study look into like this kind of like identity clash? And I guess like, what's the approach of critiquing such an identity clash? I don't know if I could refer to it as this way. But yeah, I'm just wondering about your thoughts in regards to this. Yeah.
Absolutely, Karim. Thanks so much for attending. Well,
Yeah.
you know, like I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, these questions about Sudan were what pushed me into thinking about this, right? I think that Sudan is often heavily centered as Afro-Arab identity. So I think there's a lot of works that try, by Sudanese authors in particular, that try to answer some of these questions about, well, are Sudanese Arab? Are they African? What does that mean? When do these identities emerge? So, you know, you can read these books that are listed on the syllabus, et cetera, about concepts of anti-Blackness, et cetera, in Sudan. I think that maybe one of the difficulties about having conversations about Afro-Arab identity in Sudan is that many of the works that are out there rely on older histories of Sudan that often rely on race science to describe what it means to be Black and what it means to be Arab. So you'll get these early sources from, for example, Yusuf Fadl, who will talk about the Arabs in Sudan, and he'll start to talk about those of Arab stock, those of Black stock, etc. And this is race science language. It's what was what was just considered history at the time when he wrote it. And so I think that what we can do within, I think that the key towards figuring out some of this stuff in the Sudanese context is starting to think more in terms of indigenous identities, thinking about what does Arabness mean to Northern Sudanese. Like, for example, for someone like me who comes from a Shaigi background, it's often defined as a tribal identity where you can trace your paternal ancestor back to a particular Arab figure. So it's like this very blood-based discourse, especially an agendered blood-based discourse. There is these newer conversations around Arab nationalism and that it's all about culture and language and the modern nation state and how that nation state exclusion has affected people like Nubian speakers within Northern Sudan. So I think there's a lot going on, and I think that Afro-Arab studies helps us to be able to ask, what is it meant to be Arab in the region? Has it always meant what we think of it today? And maybe that's why we have all these conflicting conversations about what it means to be African and Arab, because we're not sifting through what these definitions have meant and how they've changed over time. It's a rambling discussion, but send me another message and I think we can talk about it more later.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely reach out.
Thank you.
Faisal, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Hi, Razan.
Yes,
Yeah,
I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so it's just this like idea. I know it might be dated, but like this idea that there's no racial consciousness because it's not maybe as clear cut or as color categorized as the West. That there's no consciousness. I don't believe that. I do believe that there's a consciousness that. What do you think? What do you think, and how do you deal with this idea that a lot of quote-unquote experts or people who study the region or study the topic, they genuinely believe that there's no racial consciousness? I disagree, but I don't know how to define that. What do you think, and how do you say what you think or defend what you think?
Honestly, I think my first reaction is they often, people who say this are often appealing to discussions of race. When does it emerge? What is it? Can race emerge in a Western context, in a non-Western context, etc.? So honestly, my way of bypassing that is to not talk about racism or is so much as to talk about anti-Blackness. And I think, some people might critique that. They might say no to Zen, like, I think it's actually important to talk about race specifically in the region, but I just find it useful to talk about anti-Blackness because I think that that's what's at the basis of it all often and what's much more undeniable. I think that you can have you can get mired in arguments with people about like, oh, but it's not race because it doesn't have XYZ ingredient that we find in America. It's not segregation, so it's not race, etc. I think that I tend to just bypass it by saying, yeah, but it's anti-Blackness. So let's explain that. If it's not race, if it's not race, does that mean we stop studying it? Does that mean we stop like understanding what is forming the specific local form of anti-Blackness, how it's informing identity, etc.? So I think that I guess what I'm trying to do by bypassing and saying anti-Blackness is to try and say, well, these are the local terms and you can't ignore them. Like this is when you say, this, etc. When you have like a whole list of colorist terms delineating local ideas, and when you have like sayings, when you have stories, all these things, and I just try to turn as much as possible towards that language and address that language and talk about it, as opposed to trying to have the argument about is it race or is it not. But that's just me right now. Maybe if you talk to me in 3 years, I'll say, no, absolutely, this is how I address that. So
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maurice, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Yeah, Maurice. He asks, no, okay. Do you, he says, I would like to know your definitions of Arab, Black, and African,
etc. I see it. Okay. I think that the definition depends on the time period. All right. I think that, and it totally depends on the place, totally depends on the time period. I don't think it's something that you can broadly apply and talk about at all times. And for example, I don't think that you can, it's difficult. I think it's difficult because of that variation in time period and in place in how people define these terms. So for example, if you go to, for example, Egypt, and you meet someone who says, oh, we're not African, we're Arab, right? What does that mean? You end up having to deconstruct a lot about what do they believe about Arabness and what do they believe about Africanness, right? Do they think of Africanness as this very as basically a delineator of a historical area that's south of them, and that's why they disaddress themselves from it? Is that clashing with how we think of African identity as like a continental identity? And so I think that's already complicated, like with like why people think of themselves as African or non-African. When it comes to Arab and Black, again, some people will tell you, oh, an Arab is anybody who speaks the Arab language and partakes in Arab culture. And many minorities in Middle Eastern countries would tell you absolutely not. I speak Arabic, but I don't identify as Arab. I partake in Arab culture, but I have a very different lineage, etc., that I identify with. And I think that, so that's a whole conversation around like Arabness as a type of like cultural nationalism. And I think that then you open up historical texts where Arabness is being used to refer to a claim of paternal identity, and that's its own conversation. So I think my answer is it depends. My definitions of Arab, Black, African, it just depends on what I'm reading, who's saying it, and when they're talking. And I think you said, can you unpack all these colorist terms from Sudan, Akhdar, Ahmar, Halabi, all these kinds of, all this like colorist spectrum, right? I think that's, I actually don't think I can fully unpack it. I think that I can speak to the fact that we have a colorist spectrum in Sudan where you are graded from a term, from how dark your skin is to a very dark, azraq, akhdar, not so dark, akhdar, you know, wheat colored, gamhi, halabi, which is light skinned, and usually, and because it's the word halab, it's conflated with a particular group in Sudan who are associated with coming from the area of Aleppo. So you have those colorist terms and each carries their own history. But in my opinion, a lot of what those colorist terms in Northern Sudan serve to do is for Northern Sudanese to distance themselves from an idea of being aswad, which is, or black, because they would have encountered the term black not in terms of some kind of neutral skin color descriptor as we would think of it now, but as a negative term that would have been delineating to them not belonging to an Arabic speaking community. And so this speaks to these shifting definitions, right? Like we might think of black in the region today as just being a descriptor of skin color, but in the past it might have carried a very different connotation that I think, that's why I think we have all these colorist terms in Northern Sudan. I think it's a lot of trying to distance yourself from how Northern Africans were thinking of Black people and defining Black people. So it's a very complicated conversation, Bill. Thanks for bringing it up.
Do you want to go ahead and answer that one?
Let's see, I'll just read it out loud. So how do you reconcile the politics of Afro-Arab identity and the racialization of Sudanese in the Middle East, North Africa region, versus the distinct racialization processes that occur in the diaspora and produce their own kind of identity politics? I'm going to have to think on that one, Haneen. Give me a second to read this over again. So how do you consider all kinds of identity politics? That's really interesting, because I guess I'm thinking of like, so you're asking like how do we reconcile, for example, how Sudanese are racialized in, say, Egypt versus how they experience racialization in, for example, Sudan? Sorry, not in Sudan, in the US, for example. I think, and then there's also, I guess, the third aspect, which is Afro-Arab politics within Sudan itself, and how are Sudanese being constructed within there. This is a difficult question. I think that it's fully possible for example, someone to be considered Afro-Arab in Sudan is actually like a form of privilege, right? Because it affiliates you with Arabism and it affiliates you with like governmental power, etc. I don't think there is necessarily a clash between recognizing that and recognizing how Afro-Arabs in Sudan are positioned differently versus seeing how they are then pushed to the bottom of the ladder, for example, in Egypt or in the US. I think that I've been trying to think through this question more with other African diasporas as well. Like I'm trying to think of, for example, Somalis and their own identity politics, and how they get racialized within Somalia versus outside of it, thinking of Nigerians and the same things that they seem to go through. So I think it's a complicated conversation. I think that I don't think I necessarily have immediate answers. I've been trying to push away from exceptionalizing Sudanese as the only ones who go through this as a way of trying to understand it better, trying to think about, okay, like, is how Sudanese are placed within places of privilege within Sudan in conflict with how they are racialized outside. I don't think it's necessarily in conflict, but I think it does push Sudanese in diaspora and in places outside to have to think a lot more critically about who their parents especially might have been back in Sudan, right? Like you might be experiencing a lot of racialization in the US and affiliating yourself with blackness, etc. So then I think it can become very difficult for these kids to think about, well, actually my family comes from a place of relative privilege within Sudan itself. So I think it's a very complicated conversation or question. And I don't know if my thoughts have been helpful or not. So let us know in the chat if you want any more thoughts or questions that you have about that or clarification.
Any further questions?
I think I see one from, is it Azam?
Oh, here we
Azam
go.
Merchant? Yeah, okay, so I think Azam says, I was wondering if within archival disciplines you ever feel any tension around the use and non-use of more theoretical considerations of raciality or blackness. Okay, so one thing I should clarify is I actually have not done a lot of traditional archival work. A lot of what I've done, like I have not done the thing so far where you get a grant and you go to an archive somewhere abroad and you sit in it and you take a lot of pictures and stress about the archive and come back. I have not done that yet, and that's partly because of COVID. It's partly because I just got grounded. But so a lot of my work or the archives that I search out have been online. I've worked a lot with with texts that have been published and analyzed them for their content and stuff like that. So that's my disclaimer with the archival side of your question. But within the broader discipline, do I feel tension around the use or non-use of more theoretical considerations of raciality or blackness? Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm thinking of here is when people say things like political blackness, where they try to apply like theoretical blackness to non-black people, I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, because that's something that personally tends to make me a bit uncomfortable. At least it's something whereby the example that I'm thinking of is people talking about Afro-Arab solidarity politics and talking about North Africans as racialized as Black to the colonial powers, etc. But then they won't go as far as to actually think about, well, what are the local dynamics of Blackness within that North African country? So that is the theoretical tension that I tend to run into or disagree with. I'm not sure if that's what you meant though by your question of, do you feel tension around the use or non-use of more theoretical considerations of raciality or Blackness? So again, let me know if that was helpful or if that was what you were getting at.
Well, if there are no further questions, you all have another moment. If there are no further questions, I want to thank you so much for a very provocative discussion, a very fruitful discussion, a very important discussion. And thank you for coming back to revisit us with your newfound graduate knowledge. And we all wish you the greatest luck and or perseverance on your path, because it's an important one.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for having invited me. This was really nice. It was really nice to be in conversation with y'all. It was really great to get these great questions. I'm glad that I kept things a little shorter so I could spend more time in conversation. And Yeah, and I'll thank Ellen again, because Ellen was someone who did make space for me when I was in undergrad. It was great when she would invite, for example, Black Muslim women speakers to campus, etc., as opposed to being like, hey, let me talk all the time. So that was definitely some of the classes that she taught were some of the best ones that I took at Duke, and it's something that stayed with me for a long time. So thank you very much, Ellen, again. And thank you, Julie, who is as ever a kind sweetheart, who is always on top of everything happening in the Islamic Studies department. And again, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Maslama.
Assalamu.